Welcome everyone to this week's weekly Dharma gathering. My name is Gail Spiva, and tonight's session will be led by J.D. Doyle and is titled The Liberatory Practice of Dismantling White Supremacy. J.D. will lead us through a guided meditation, Dharma talk, and we'll close with a Q&A discussion. Tonight's session will be recorded, so if you prefer not to be seen, please turn off your camera feature now. Please note that you'll also be recorded when you ask a question. Also, if you have a question during the guided meditation instruction or the talk, please feel free to enter it in the chat box at any time, and we'll be able to address it during the discussion period. The recording of tonight's gathering will be accessed within 48 hours via your purchased products or on your Vimeo weekly Dharma gathering account. You'll receive an email notification once it's posted. And about JD. JD serves as a core teacher at the East Bay Meditation Center in Oakland, California, and is completing the Spirit Rock Meditation Center teacher training. JD has practiced Buddhism since 1995 in the US, Thailand, and Burma. For over 20 years, they worked as a public school teacher focusing on issues of equity and access. JD holds a BS in Environmental Studies from Cornell University and a Master's in Language and Literacy and Sociocultural Studies from the University of New Mexico. JD identifies as genderqueer. They are committed to celebrating the diversity of our human Sangha, addressing the impact of racism on our communities, expanding concepts of gender, and living in ways that honor the sacredness of the earth. So take it away, JD.
Thank you so much, Gail. It's really wonderful to be here tonight. And, you know, it's quite a remarkable time period that we're in right now as a country and really globally, having both the impact of the pandemic, the uprisings around racial injustice, and then coupling that with a lot of economic uncertainty and the continuing process of the global climate change. So we just have a lot to be alive to right now in our world. So we're going to start by taking some time to go inward and meditate. So I invite you all to take a posture to meditate in. Any posture. The Buddha invited us to meditate in any posture. That could be standing or sitting, lying down, and just allow yourself to be both alert and relaxed. Taking a few deep breaths if that's available to you. Connecting with your body, connecting with the breath. Allowing yourself to be here in this moment just as you are. Bringing your awareness inward to see what is alive for you in this moment. Bringing curiosity to the body, heart, mind. Tenderness, caring, loving awareness. We use our practice of meditation to turn towards our experience, not to make it a certain way or to get rid of anything, but to acknowledge, to be mindful of what is arising. And as we connect with the body, with the breath, with the heart, with the mind. We'll recognize that it's a practice. That as we have an intention to be awake, to be aware, to be mindful, we'll be distracted by the tendencies of mind, our conditioning. And so you're invited during this formal meditation period to notice what the atmosphere of the mind is. Is there a sense of movement into the future, of wanting, of craving, wanting the meditation to be a certain way? Or perhaps you may notice some aversion in the mind, in the heart, in the body, a disliking, a preference for not having the body, the heart, or the mind show up as it is right now, wanting things to be different than they are. At other times during our meditation, we may experience a numbness, a lack of feeling, a sense of confusion. Can we welcome this too with our loving awareness, knowing that these mind states of greed, clinging, of aversion, dislike, or delusion or confusion are conditioned and temporary and will arise and pass away. And that our practice of meditation, of mindfulness, is one of becoming intimate with oneself and how they manifest, how they arise, how they pass away. One of learning, one of curiosity and insight into the nature of the world, the nature of ourselves, and the nature of our communities. You may want to check in with your body to see if there's any extra tension that you're holding in the body as you meditate. Breathing into the area around the eyes, inviting the eyes to relax, letting go, not making it be so, but a gentle connection to the body, invitation to relax and let go. And then connecting in to the area around the jaw. And if possible, on the exhale, inviting the area around the jaw to relax, letting go of any extra tension. And then checking in with the area around the neck and the shoulders, knowing that this is an area that many people hold extra tension. The invitation is to imagine that you could breathe into that area. And on the exhale, inviting the neck and the shoulders to relax, letting go, relaxing any extra tension, the neck and the shoulders. And then checking in with the torso, the back, and the rest of the body. The invitation to relax any areas that may be holding extra tension. Just coming close, turning towards, not needing to fix it or make it better, but from a place of deep care, tender, loving awareness. Connecting with the body and the breath. Noticing what's alive for you right now. What's the atmosphere in the mind, in the body? Sometimes we can notice there's a bit of striving happening in the mind, desire to make our meditation a certain way. And then checking in with the body, we might find some contraction in some way that we want things to be a certain way. Coming close with mindfulness, with loving awareness to this moment, meeting it with tenderness and care, showing up for ourselves. Other times we may find the mind distracted, restless. And checking in with the body, we may feel the restlessness arising in the body. Connecting with ourselves with as much care as possible, offering kindness. To acknowledge ourselves just as we are. Whatever's arising. As we come towards the end of this period of meditation, the invitation is to appreciate your efforts of showing up and creating this space for stillness and connection in your life, for showing up for yourself just as you are. And then extending that appreciation to others who are here with us tonight, near and far, in this practice of liberation, freedom from greed, freedom from hatred, freedom from delusion, the causes of suffering. And as we practice together, may we cultivate these beautiful qualities: kindness, care, generosity, patience. May we develop the wisdom to see clearly what is needed to be done in this moment, at this time, so that we may act skillfully and with kindness and love for the benefit of all beings. May all beings in all directions, may all beings in all worlds, may all beings without exception be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. So if you need to do a quick stretch or whatever from your meditation, just allowing yourself to do that. That was mentioned earlier that we are recording this, both the audio and the visual. So if you prefer to not have your pictures on the screen, you can turn off your screen, and just wanting to let you know that. And also that if you are going to share for the questions, that will be recorded as well. So Gail mentioned that the title of this is kind of a lofty title for today's talk, The Liberatory Practice of Dismantling White Supremacy. And so I'm not offering this, oops, we finished meditating already. So I'm offering this talk not from a place of having accomplished any of this, but just rather from a place of deep, deep passion for how I want to live in the world, how I choose to be in the world, and really the belief in the transformation, how transformative the Buddhist practice is. And so it's from that place that I wanted to share today. And I wanted to start with a story of something that happened to me about 15 years ago. I was teaching in the summer, well, not this summer, but in many summers they have family retreats at many meditation centers. And so I worked a lot with children, and so I was acting as one of the teachers for the family retreat. And I was at the art tent, and there was all this paint everywhere, and we had those tiny little Buddhist statues, the little ceramic ones that you paint, and the kids were painting them, and there were two kids left in the tent, and on the other side was the box of all the empty ones, and over here was all the painted ones being laid out to dry. And at the retreats, this was a Western convert Dharma center, and as with so many of our centers, there's primarily white families, although there were a few people of color. And so I was in the art tent with the two last kids from my group, and they were placing their little Buddha statues over on the side to dry. And one little girl, a little white girl, looked at the other little girl's Buddha statue, and her own statue was like really brightly colored, lots of colors on it. And this other statue was just brown. And she said to the other little girl, she's like, the Buddha wasn't brown. And, as it turned out, this other little child was a person of color. And I was just really astonished, because here is this little girl telling this other girl, person of color, that the Buddha wasn't brown. And I share this not to shame this little girl, being like, oh, she shouldn't say that. Although, there were things that we did as a result of that interaction in the group that we were in. But to really look at, the pervasiveness and the deep-seated conditioning of white people in the United States towards whiteness. And just that sense that this little girl had such authority that she felt like she could say to this other child, the Buddha wasn't brown, even though, there was this big statue, like I think it's bronze, of the Buddha that's brown in the Dharma Hall. But somehow she had in her mind that she had internalized this superiority, and that this figure that was close to her was not that color. And so this is part of what uprooting white supremacy means to me, is these experiences that we encounter all the times in our hearts and our minds and our Dharma centers and our communities, of how white supremacy gets seeped in to our thoughts and our experiences. And so I'm still in this process. This is part of what to me it means to be human in this lifetime, to me to be born a white queer individual, that I'm going to be uprooting white supremacy and whiteness. And that I'll continue to make mistakes, and that could happen today. And so I'm part of this journey of learning. But I really want to share, because I'm committed to the liberation of all beings, and I'm committed to uprooting this injustice, and especially around racial injustice. And so I want to start speaking to this term of white supremacy. So Michael Eric Dyson, who many of you know as an academic, author, preacher, says white supremacy is the conscious or unconscious belief or the investment in the inherent superiority of some, while others are believed to be innately inferior. And it doesn't demand individual participation of the singular person. It is a machine operating in perpetuity, because it doesn't demand that somebody be in place driving. And so this is that underlying current that we can get swept up in unconsciously. And so sometimes it comes to the consciousness, but sometimes we are not even in the driving seat. It's embedded in all these institutions and the legacies that we have. And some people I know find this term white supremacy a bit inflammatory or dramatic, and think that it points solely to white power or white nationalism. But I use it intentionally, because as a white person, I've realized that the culture of white supremacy is this amorphous atmosphere. Some people say it's like the water that we're swimming in, it's like the air we breathe, and has been such a cause of great ignorance and great harm. And so in order to promote the clarity of clear seeing, I use the term white supremacy. I want to read this other focus of why using the term white supremacy is important, from Edgar Villanueva, from his book, Decolonizing Wealth. And he says, this is him saying this, I use the term white supremacy instead of racism because it explicitly names who in the system benefits and implicitly bears the burden. So who it explicitly benefits. So those of us who have white skin. And so I know I'm offering this talk to many people of many different races. And so you may feel as though some of what I say applies to you and some of it doesn't. So just really listening to take in with curiosity and investigation. And so Edgar Villanueva says, I use the term white supremacy instead of racism because it explicitly names who in the system benefits and implicitly who bears the burden. He continues, one of the tactics of domination is to control the language around the perpetrator's bad behavior. To call the phenomena racism makes it abstract and erases explicit mention of those who profit from the dynamic. So bringing in this term makes us look clearly at what's happening. What is the conditioning from which arises the behavior? And as part of our practice, this attitude of curiosity and investigation into the causes and conditions of what is arising is so important. Because when we look at it, then we can uproot the habit tendencies of the mind, and then we can create opportunities for freedom and for decisions and actions that are skillful. So oftentimes one of the things that happens is when we hear things like white supremacy or racism, this shame and blame and the contraction of aversion can arise, and we can end up just clouding the mind with these other tendencies. And so today I'm going to really have us look closely and clearly at the tendencies that arise so that we can begin to dismantle and disrupt the habits of mind. And so the way that I want to do that today is by looking at the three roots that many of you are familiar with of greed, hatred, and delusion. These are called, in Buddhism, the three unwholesome roots. And so they're often referenced in many ways. And today I want to look at those three roots specifically as they relate to uprooting or dismantling white supremacy and racial injustice. Bhikkhu Analayo, who's a Theravadan monk and scholar, in his most recent paper, Confronting Racism with Mindfulness, says that confronting racial oppression, whose roots are the unwholesome states of greed, aversion, and delusion, is indeed following in the footsteps of the Buddha. And it's interesting that he needs to say this. And I think this points to how some people think that this practice of looking at racial oppression is other than Buddhism. And so that he feels like we needs to really point out that looking at the unwholesome states of greed, aversion, and delusion is the practice of Buddhism. It's really important to me. And Bhikkhu Bodhi as well has pointed to this, that these three are the underlying roots of violent conflict and injustice. And so it's really important that as we practice, that we can see using these three tools, these three frames of reference. And so during our meditation, we looked at kind of this aspect of greed, where we're kind of moving into wanting the world to be a certain way, and the aversion of pulling away, and that place of delusion where the mind is just kind of cloudy. So I wanted to start off with delusion, because it's actually said that delusion underlies greed and hatred. And I found the teaching by Rob Burbea, who's another Theravadan teacher who talks a lot about delusion. And he says that freeing oneself from delusion is like a snake abandoning its worn out old skin. And I really like this idea, this image right now of a snake abandoning its worn out old skin, because it speaks to me a lot of this time that we're in. You know, this abandoning of the skin, this place, these habit tendencies of mind that are no longer serving us. And then he says that when we look with these lenses, we can look at any moment to be seen clearly rather than deluded. And we can be deluded by this, how our moment is constructed. And he says the construction of each moment is a mix of assumptions, conceptions, reactions, inclinations, conscious and unconscious. And so these are all of the habit tendencies of mind, our perceptions, our concepts, all of these arise and we can be deluded by them. And it's really hard. Delusion is one of the hardest things to break through. When we break through delusion, that's when wisdom arises. And so it's such a hard thing to see clearly when we're deluded, because by definition, delusion is confusion. Gina Sharp, who's one of my teachers and one of the leaders of the training program at Spirit Rock that I'm in, says that even with our intentions, the deeply conditioned by the racist society, we, despite our best intentions, we don't always see clearly. And so she says, just because there are Buddhist spaces, we think that somehow people should be sincere, receptive, and transparent, that by virtue of our intention to wake up, by virtue of being Buddhist, that we should all be like sincere, receptive, and transparent. And we like to think that it's nice, you know, we like, oh, this is all these good people, and we are. And that also means that we still have to have wise action. And she continues and says, we're complicated beings, and although we have the best of intentions, we are deeply conditioned by a racist society. These are the assumptions and concepts and perceptions that we were talking about earlier. We are deeply conditioned by a racist society, she says. Our resistance to de-racializing the mind is high because we're human. We love our conditioned minds because we've been living with them for a very long time and we're familiar with them. You know, I think this is an area that we don't look at enough. That we think, oh, yes, I want to be free. I want to be free. I want to get rid of, I want to lose this. But she says, we have been conditioned by a racist society and we love our conditioned minds because we've been living with them for a very long time and we're familiar with them. This familiarity, like you have that old blanket or whatever that you wear and it's all soft and snuggling. You think, I really should get rid of it. But this kind of like it. It might not be serving us anymore, but we're familiar with it. And so there becomes this momentum to get comfortable. And so Gina continues in this and says, we need an extraordinary amount of patience is needed. We need to figure out ways to be creative and listen deeply to what is needed and to learn through love, compassion, and kindness to create our own pathways to change. They're there, but they have to be excavated. So this is the place that I'd like to point to about dismantling white supremacy. So we looked at the conditions of white supremacy, but Gina is saying that they have to be excavated. So there's this place of like, oh yes, I love this like nice fuzzy old comfortable blanket, but now I need to look into and excavate and dismantle what's really going on underneath all of that. If we look at dismantle in the dictionary, it means to disconnect the pieces of, or to strip of the covering, or to divest. And so when we're dismantling, we're taking our mindfulness and we're looking at it, and then we're investigating, we're exploring to see what's there. And so when we can look at the forces of greed or hatred or delusion through the lens of this conditions of legacies of racial injustice, we can see that the need for de-racialization is necessary, that it's not enough just to see that racial injustice exists. We need to excavate it and dismantle it. And we need to wake up to these conditions that exist in our mind and uproot, as the Buddha says, we need to uproot these qualities, these tendencies of the mind of greed, hatred, and delusion. So obviously, this is a very large area, and I'm just going to give some flavors of this. So we talked a little bit about delusion, and now I want to kind of give some flavors of greed and of hatred. So when we look at greed, we encounter that way that the body goes towards attachment or grasping, and oftentimes we think of it as happiness and satisfaction outside of ourselves. And so part of our practice is to come home with ourselves so that we can find refuge here and now. And so one of the places that greed with its underlying ignorance intersects in our practice in white supremacy culture is this desire for comfort. And so when we look at, there's some papers that have looked at what are some of the characteristics of what's called white supremacy culture. Comfort is one of those characteristics. There is a thought that we kind of deserve comfort, that comfort is a goal. And especially when we look at our consumeristic capitalistic society, comfort is often put out there as one of these things that we should aspire to make life easier, more efficient, just make things, just a little bit better. And so the way that manifests when we look at the habit tendencies of mind of greed within this culture of white supremacy is that we kind of think, oh, I'm kind of practice and I just want it to be a little bit easier. And wouldn't that be nice? And so we all come to practice thinking that. And sometimes we actually find a little bit of comfort there. And we're just, and ultimately, we need to look at what is it that we're practicing for. And so Thubten Chodron, who's a Buddhist nun, the Tibetan tradition, says, my concern with Buddhism in the West is that there's some block to really looking deeply at what dukkha means. Dukkha is the Pali word for suffering. A block to really looking deeply at what suffering means. People want light and love and bliss. Many people come to Buddhism to achieve a better psychological state and feel better about themselves. And that's fine. We can help them on that level. So many of us have come here because somebody said, oh, this will be helpful. You'll feel better. You'll have more calm, more spaciousness, more ease, this sort of psychological aspect of Buddhism. And then Tubten Chodron continues and says, but that's not the depth to which the Buddhist teachings go. If we don't spend time considering what dukkha is, then we won't seek liberation and awakening. Instead, we'll use the Dharma only to make our samsaric life a little bit better. That's one of my fears for Buddhism in the West, that we lose the liberating aspect of the Dharma. So she says, instead, we'll use the Dharma only to make our life a little bit better. That's one of my fears, she says, for Buddhism in the West, that we lose the liberating aspect of the Dharma. So what Tubten Chodron is pointing to is this psychological state of comfort and calm that many Buddhist practitioners, particularly in Western convert Dharma centers that are primarily white, conflate with liberation. So there's a sense that if we get a little bit of calm, we get a little bit of ease, perhaps we look like the statue of the Buddha just sitting there, able to deal with the variations of the world with just this sense of ease that we have hit enlightenment. But what happens is that comfort could also be coming, especially for white, from a place of privilege, that we're in comfort because we have these pillows of privilege around us that insulate us from some of the violence and racial injustice of society. And so engaging with this place of what does it mean to have calm in our practice? What does it mean to get a little bit of peace? Is this truly liberation? And so sometimes what happens is we get a little bit of calm and we get a little confused and we think, oh, I'm really getting this. This is like, I'm getting a kind of a little awakened here. And then we mistake this sense for calm and ease with liberation. And then somebody else comes up and they're in the messiness of their life. And the messiness may have to do with the causes and conditions of white supremacy in the world. And then from my place of calm and ease, especially if I'm a white practitioner like myself, it can seem that I'm getting into white supremacy reasoning. So if we think of the word white supremacy, thinking of calm and ease as superior. And the Buddha has said over and over again that once we think of something as superior or inferior, we are in a judging mind and we are not free from greed, hatred, and delusion. And so we get this idea that peace and calm in the mind, we get that by emptying out the contents of the mind. That, if only I had nothing happening in the mind, then I will be peaceful. Instead of being in our lives just as it is, including it all, including the uprisings, including the turbulence, including the grief, including the rage. If we use our mindfulness to limit and censor our attention to only that which is comfortable, we won't have full liberation. We'll get stuck in this place of just kind of reaching a plateau that mimics comfort and can really conflate with white supremacy. And so one of the places that the Buddha's instructions are really helpful in this is that the Buddha has instructed us in the Satipatthana Sutta, which is the sutta on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, that we both need to use our mindfulness to look internally and externally, and both internally and externally. So if we're using our mindfulness just to look internally and we find peace and calm there, and then there's other things happening outside, we should be able to, in our sense of interbeing and our interconnectedness, to navigate between all the experiences of the world. So engaging with discomfort is a real critical piece of our practice. And actually one of the foundations in the Satipatthana Sutta explicitly mentions looking at pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. And I wanted to share another quote from Bhikkhu Analayo and from his recent paper that he wrote on mindfulness and anti-racism. And he points out, and he's speaking from some of the research that's mostly been done recently on racial justice and mindfulness. And he says that both Polinska and Burgess, who I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing them right, they're both researchers, have pointed out that mindfulness offers a possibility of opening a conscious space that allows for a reduction in automatic racist associations. And so that with our mindfulness practice, we can actually see, we can turn towards, and we can become more conscious of when we have a racist thought or a racist conditioning arise. And he says, and he's quoting from Burgess here, that this can serve to counter a tendency where the white social lens distorts reality by refusing to acknowledge systemic discrimination, conveniently maintaining amnesia about the racial injustice in the past and present. And so we can use our individual practice to use this lens to see the systemic discrimination that's happening. And this is so important that we put this effort in, because as they mentioned, there's this maintenance of amnesia, especially in white culture, of racial injustice in the past and how it arises in the present. And so that by cultivating mindfulness, he says, we have a portal into the visceral experience of prejudice. And so instead of seeking to maintain and grasp onto the sense of comfort, we can really tune into what's here. This real sense of feeling the fullness of our hearts, which may be the experience of grief, which may be the experience of rage, which may be the experience of deep harm that's happened to so many people in our society based on race. Ruth King, who's another mindfulness teacher, calls mindfulness heart surgery. And I really like this because she's, in her book, Mindful of Race, she talks about using mindfulness as a tool to open our hearts so that we can know that it's not something that's out there beyond us, that race and racism and legacies of racial injustice are not something that just happen out there, but in this interconnected between ourselves and others, that they're impacting our own hearts. And that we can investigate the causes and the conditions of racial history, our racial beliefs, the impulses, the habit tendencies towards greed for comfort, aversion to discomfort, and then we can explore what happens in our practice. One of the things that has happened for me as I begin to look at this is that I see so much of what I've learned has been influenced by the racial conditioning of my own experience. And so, it has really changed, what I do and how I behave and how I engage. And I was just talking recently, and I was working with a group of people in a tech company, and I got a email from a friend who works in the tech company and said that just recently Google and Chrome and Android have changed their language, and they're no longer using the terms blacklist for certain sites and whitelist for other sites. That this is the example of just like the way that, like we use these languages, that they've infiltrated and our consciousness and our ways of being in the world, that we elevate lightness, enlightenment, and then blackness is thought to be something dreadful. And so as we use our mindfulness, we can turn towards language, and we can just see how that works in our hearts and our minds and our bodies. And so fortunately, because of this uprisings that have happened, people have been tuning their minds to and turning their hearts and really been willing to make changes so that we can know that the things that have been happening need to change and then make changes like this that seems really small, just a white list or black list, and have new names for that, so that what we're upholding is not racialized. And I want to share from this activist who talks about kind of this sense of this momentum and this time, and how situations, we can look at them as individual experiences, or we can look at them as part of the fabric. And this is Nicole Hannah-Jones. And she says, for white people who've been trained since birth to see themselves as individuals, the collective fear and collective grief that Black Americans feel can be hard to grasp. But for Black Americans like me, the killings of Black people at the hands of the state with no justice to be had is among the oldest and most familiar American stories. And so this is one of the places that the delusion and the aversion arise in practice. When I think, oh, I didn't mean to do that. For me, it's just an individual incident that happened where I may have interrupted or said something inappropriate or cut someone off. But if I am a marginalized person, particularly a Black person in this culture, I'm looking at it through this lens of histories, especially like the killing of Black people that's happened in this country since the beginning of our country, the oldest and most familiar of American stories. So what does it mean for us as Buddhists here in the United States to look at our communities, to look at who's here and who's not? Ruth King says about this that the analogy she uses is that in this dominant white culture, we have such a focus on individualism, which is another white supremacy characteristic, culture of white supremacy. And then we see things as stars. But in the Black community, there's a connection. And when they look up, they see the constellation, the connection between the incidents. And so then this gives rise to what we've come to know as microaggressions, and people seeing that things happen over and over again. And so it's really one of those places that with our mindfulness, we can become to see clearly that an incident that happens can be connected to the whole fabric and the whole history of our society. And so I wanted to finish by talking about another story that I've had in working with kids. And some of you may have heard this story before, but it was just such a really insightful and just a really astonishing event for me. In my 20s, when I first moved to Oakland in California, I was working at a nature center down on Lake Merritt, which is a lake in the middle of downtown Oakland. And we had all these animals there, and kids would come, and I would bring animals to parks and schools and libraries, and people would come to visit the center as well. And there were often kids who came after school to help me with caring for the animals and feeding them or cleaning their cages or other things. And there was a couple, two boys who came over a lot. An older brother, probably 10 or so, and then a younger brother who was 4. And one day, this little boy who was 4 said to me, "I want to be like you when I grow up." And I thought, oh yeah, he wants to work with animals. It's my job, you know, he's excited about that. And I said, oh, so you want to work with animals? What do you want to do with animals? And he looked at me and he's like, no, I want to be like you. And he picked up my arm and he pointed to my skin, and he was African American. And he said, I want to be like you. And here I was, 26, and he's 4. And he already had so much wisdom around racial conditioning in the country that I grew up in, that I supposedly college educated, knew something. But he knew in his body and his heart and mind that I had more privilege. And that's ignorance that I had. He had more awareness, more wisdom about how race played out. And like so many young people, they want to move, have this success, be. And he saw that in me, in the color of my skin. And so this is part of my liberatory practice. This is part that success shouldn't be based on the color of your skin. And having that experience of having someone that young, or like the little girl I told at the beginning, just having somehow imbibed her superiority because of her whiteness. So it's so important for me as part of our practice in Buddhism that we commit towards uprooting, towards dismantling these forces of greed, hatred, and delusion and how they arise through our legacies of racial injustice. It's really important to me that we look deeply into our hearts and our minds with our practice to turn our mindfulness internally and see what's happening here, and externally to uproot all the causes that then give rise to prejudice and discrimination, systemic, institutionalized policies that are unfair. And so it's so important to me that this process that we engage in is ongoing, and that it's not something that we ever get right or we do because we want to look good. It's because we are part of this fabric of liberatory communities, of this radically inclusive desire for freedom for all beings. And so as we finish right now, I just want to remind us that we may each have had conditions in our lives that have brought us to these times, and that these habit tendencies can be uprooted, and that the forces of love and compassion and generosity are strong, and we can develop them to create worlds that are sustainable and nurturing for everyone in our community, so that we can dismantle this oppressive system of white supremacy and have regenerative, sustainable systems in our communities. So thank you so much for your kind attention. I appreciate being on this journey with you of learning and unlearning and exploring liberatory practices of the Buddha. And so we have some time for questions or comments. If you want to put any in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute and speak aloud, you could do that right now.
Thank you so much, JD. That was really just a fantastic talk. One thing I wanted to just go and throw out there is, and I'm going to mispronounce his name, Resma Menachem. He did My Grandmother's Hands. He talks about white skin supremacy as a term, and I kind of am liking that as a way that it really does go and own the white skin being the supremacy part. And I was wondering what you think about using that term.
Yeah. I think that's a great term. He has some other terms that I really appreciate as well. And to me, it's really interesting because people have a hard time using the word, whiteness or white supremacy. And so to me, that points to this way of just sort of kind of just, I can handle looking at racism. It's because it's a little bit out here and I do my best. I'm not racist, but if I have to look at my own whiteness. So to me, the term is less important than so white skin helps get us closer to this sense of what it is that is keeping us apart and allowing us to hold all the resources over here and not allow for this distribution and hold ourselves in comfort and protection. So his work is really beautiful because he gets to the somatic experiencing of it. And to me, that's the part that's really important. And I know for some people, using the term white supremacy just brings up so much shame and that it's inaccessible. But part of what I've seen is there's also a need for white people to bring up this stamina so that we can stay in the room and address it. And so that's why I'm bringing that sense in of like, it being more explicit rather than just like, oh, racism, because that happened back then, it's not happening now, as we know from the uprisings that's happening, that it's very alive in our culture. So thank you for pointing to that. I really appreciate his work a lot.
Yes, yes. And I also really appreciated your points about many people, many white people getting attached to this idea of liberation being about, the peace and calm, as opposed to, because that again kind of falls back to the individual, how the individual is experiencing things, as opposed to, all beings. That while peace and calm for all beings would be a wonderful thing, yeah, you can't get there from here without going through discomfort. At least in the way the world is now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And from an experience as like just kind of bringing in my place as somebody who identifies non-binary in my gender, like anytime we try to set things up as a binary, like comfort is where we want, discomfort is not, that we know, like being in intimate relationships with anybody, there's discomfort, and that there's so much beauty in meeting ourselves in our own places, being in relationship with ourselves. If we throw out the discomfort, we really need it all pieces, all parts of ourselves, of our communities, of our humanity. It's all needs to be part of the mix, that we need to include, have this radical inclusivity in our own practice, in our own hearts and minds. So yeah, I find that, and it's not to say that we shouldn't have places where we're resting and self-care. That's not the point that I'm trying to make. I'm just pointing to this aversion that when we are in that place of comfort, is there attachment and this idea of like, adding on to like, I've made it, and can then bring in the conceit that can then conflate with white privilege. So yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wanted to see if there are other questions out there too. Thanks, Gail.
It's not so much a question, but I was just like interested in what you were saying about using the terms whiteness and white supremacy as sort of like bringing things closer to white people and sort of prompting them to investigate how what can initially seem out there actually like arises in here as well. And yeah, that feels really important. And so just thinking about sort of like distance and closeness, I guess. And I feel like one thing that's been helpful for me in engaging with this work is conceptions around self and not self, and like being able to conceive of my conditioning around whiteness and white supremacy as something that I didn't make, that I didn't choose, but that has come down to me and come down to all of the other white folks in this country, and that is ours to investigate and dismantle and take responsibility for, basically, and so that that can sort of balance out a tendency to really construct a sense of shameful self around all of that. So yeah, if you have any thoughts on any of that, I'd be curious to hear. And thank you for your talk.
Thank you. That that seems like a very skillful way of using the sense of interconnectedness of not self, of anatta, of like that this is a, these are habit tendencies that come through to disengage that sense of shame. And I also heard in there that desire for accountability, and accountability is very different than shame. Like shame is just a real contractive emotion that's paralyzing, isolating, whereas accountability is very relational. And so there's a way that you're talking that I hear that sense of being relational in maintaining the connection. Like this isn't mine, but I am swimming in it. It's arising in me. Just like people will use the term for like, I'm not an angry person. There's anger arising in me. This is white supremacy arising in me. This is, greed arising in me, or seeing the roots of it in that way. So thank you. Yeah. Appreciate your comment. So we just have a couple minutes if anybody else wants to make a comment or add anything in. So I really want to appreciate all of you for showing up, and just really the way that we can turn our practice towards this liberatory practice of dismantling white supremacy in our own hearts, in our sanghas, and our communities, and just really making this commitment to an ongoing practice of liberation for all beings, and really understanding how necessary it is to uproot these forces so that we can have freedom for all beings. And Gail, I think you had some announcements before we end. I think you're muted.
Thank you, JD. So I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. And just to let you know, we're going to be, the online Dharma gathering is going to be taking a break from live Wednesday evening gatherings for the rest of the summer. We'll be returning on September 2nd with a new cycle of teachers. In the meantime, we'll be sharing compassion practices and guided meditations in July and August. Consider becoming a subscriber if you are not already. We have a 7-day free trial that you can find on our website. Tell your friends. In addition, make sure to follow us on Instagram at Weekly Dharma and Facebook at Weekly Dharma Gathering. So
maybe we can end by dedicating the merit of our time together. Is that what did you have anything else to add? I hope I didn't interrupt you.
Nope, that was perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. So one of the things that we can do after a period of dedication of our practice is that we can reflect on our interconnectedness, and we can dedicate what's called the merit or the goodness or the energy of our practice. So just taking a moment to reflect on our time together and our inclinations and intentions towards creating hearts and minds that are free from greed, free from hatred, free from delusion, and transforming our society, transforming legacies of racial injustice, transforming culture of white supremacy to create communities of liberatory beings, using our practice to liberate all beings from suffering. May any merit of our practice this evening be offered to all beings in all directions, in all worlds. May all beings, without exception, be free from suffering and the causes of suffering.
Great, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much. If you are interested in any of the other events that I do, my website is heartmindteaching.com. So it's just heart, mind, one word, teaching altogether is one word.com. And that's where you can see other events. And I'm offering through the East Bay Meditation Center this Saturday with a team of teachers a day-long solidarity and stamina for white practitioners. So a similar one to theme as today, but for a whole day long. So if that's something of interest, you could see that at East Bay Meditation Center or on my own website. So thanks.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right.
Check it out. Okay.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.